First appearing in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2011, Volume 100, Issue 4, was the study Desensitization to Media Violence, Links with Habitual Media Violence Exposure, Aggressive Cognitions, and Aggressive Behaviour, which was developed by Barbara Krahé, Ingrid Moller, L. Roll Huesmann, Lucina Kirwil, Julianne Felber, and Anja Berger. Their aim and study was to examine the links between desensitization to violent media stimuli and habitual media exposure as a predictor and aggressive conditions and behaviour as outcome variables. In achieving their aim, the researchers came to 4 key hypotheses that they believed would be the outcome of their study. The first hypothesis was that the higher the individual's exposure to violent media in the past, the lower the physiological arousal present in response to a violent video clip. The second hypothesis proposed that the higher the individual's exposure to violent media in the past, the less anxious and the more pleasant arousal they would display in response to a violent video clip. Hypothesis 3 was also linked to arousal, in that they proposed that the lower the anxious arousal and higher the pleasant arousal of individuals in response to a violent video clip, the more quickly accessible aggressive cognitions will be. And finally, the fourth hypothesis was that the relationship between emotional arousal to film clips and aggressive cognitions or behaviour are dependent on the violent contact of the arousing stimulus. In order to conduct the study, participants were selected from students enrolled in a range of courses at the University of Potsdam in Germany, who responded to an invitation to participate in the study. They consisted of 625 undergraduate students, of which 413 were male and 212 were females. The mean age of participants was 23.7 years, and each was offered either €15 or 3 hours of course credit for their participation in the task. The participants' task was split into 2 key parts, the second of which required them to take part in a laboratory session. The first part of the study involved participants completing an online questionnaire, which asked questions that were answered through a 5-point scale to gain information on the individual's habitual media violence exposure, trait aggression, and aggressive normative beliefs. Trait arousability was determined through a 7-point scale. Once each participant's violent media viewing habits and character profiles were determined, they were then required to participate in the laboratory task. To begin with, they were connected to a device to measure their skin conduction level for the duration of the task. Participants were then shown a violent video film clip, followed by either a sad or a funny film clip, with the order reversed for half of the participants. Immediately after each clip, participants were required to complete self-reported affective responses and perceptions in response to the clip using a 7-point scale. Accessibility of aggressive thoughts was determined after completion of the review of the second clip through a lexical decision task, and aggressive behaviour was then determined through a competitive reaction task. Results from the online study showed significant gender differences, with men scoring higher on media violence exposure, acceptance of aggressive norms, and violent behaviour, whilst women scored higher on trait arousability. The laboratory measures of aggression and self-reported emotional arousal found that men scored significantly higher on pleasant arousal in response to the violent video clips, whilst women scored significantly higher on anxious arousal. Men were also more prone to unprovoked aggression in the competitive reaction task. As expected, the violent film clips were perceived as highly violent, the sad clips had significantly higher sadness ratings, and the funny clips produced significantly higher funniness ratings. Therefore, the clips successfully represented their categories. The correlations from parts 1 and 2 of the study showed that habitual media violence exposure had a strong positive correlation with trait aggression, pleasant arousal to the video violent clip, and with a quicker recognition of aggressive words in the lexical decisions task. So what conclusions can we make from the results in regards to the initial hypothesis? We see that habitual media violence exposure had a negative correlation with skin conductance level results, which supports hypothesis 1 in that the more participants were used to media violence, the less physiological response they would show, thus displaying desensitization. The positive correlation between media violence exposure and pleasant arousal, and the lack of a significant link between media violence exposure and arousal whilst watching sad or funny clips, supports the second hypothesis, as there is an evident link between the stimuli and the response. Hypothesis 3 could not be clearly accepted. Despite the lower anxiety levels being significantly related to unprovoked aggression in the competitive reaction tasks, it could not be directly attributed as a response to the violent film clips. Higher habitual media violence exposure resulted in a more positive response to violent scenes than those with low exposure, while both exposure groups had similar responses to sad and funny film clips, displaying the variation only in regards to violent film clips. The higher violence content also resulted in an increased accessibility of aggressive cognitions and behaviours, thus supporting hypothesis 4. Was this study subject to any limitations? Of course. Despite the acceptance of most of the hypotheses, there were a few aspects that may limit the study's impact. Measures of anxious and pleasant arousal were obtained after the viewing of each clip, rather than during, which may have impacted on the instantaneous effect of the stimuli. Also, the responses for this study were only obtained in regards to passive violent media stimuli, in this case film clips, rather than active violent media such as video games. The use of active violent media may have provided either increased or decreased support for the hypotheses. Finally, as with any study that is conducted within a laboratory environment, it is susceptible to dispositional factors, which may alter the emotional reactions of the participants. So now that we've covered the details of the study, what relevance does this study have with the topic of whether media violence exposure increases an individual's likelihood to engage in violent behaviour? While a large amount of previous research has focused simply on discovering an existing relationship between media violence and violent behaviour, this study focuses on the desensitizational reasoning behind the relationship. This helps to determine the psychological learning process that develops a link within the brain between the media stimuli and the aggressive response. It also aids in determining the mindset behind the aggressive behaviour, in that the pleasant arousal gained through high exposure to violent media develops a greater accessibility of aggressive cognitions and behaviours. The focus on desensitization is also relevant in displaying the short-term exponential nature of habitual exposure to violent media stimuli, which helps to support the speed of the increase in likelihood of an individual engaging in violent behaviour. Where the study lacks or is limited in its relevance to the topic is that there is a slightly higher focus on the arousal levels and short-term responses to the violent video clips and resulting behaviours, rather than focusing on the longer-term effects of repeated exposure to violent media.